Imagine you wake up and your neighbor accuses you of stealing the cookies from their cookie jar. What would you do? The police show up at your door and they're going to arrest you. Do they just put you in a jail cell, lock the door, and throw away the keys? What happens next? Well, that's not how it goes down. In fact, you'll be given what's called a trial. You'll go to a courtroom and you will have the ability to defend yourself. And if you were accused of stealing the cookies from the cookie jar, you would actually get to defend yourself and would be judged by what's called a jury of your peers. And a jury is made up of people like you and me. It would be your neighbors, people who live in the same town as you, the same county as you, who would hear the case, they would hear the arguments, and determine if, in fact, they believe you were guilty. If they believe you stole the cookies from the cookie jar, or if you were falsely accused, or if there's just not enough evidence, because there has to be evidence. But a jury is a group of 12 people, your neighbors, who determine if you are guilty or not guilty of committing a crime you were accused of, stealing the cookies from the cookie jar. Now, you wouldn't have to do it alone, because when you're accused of a crime, you have a right to a lawyer, someone who knows the law, who practices law, who would work on your behalf. You could either pay them or have, for lack of a better term, a free lawyer appointed to you, but someone who would attempt to argue that you did not, in fact, steal the cookies from the cookie jar. That's a lawyer. If the jury determined that you were guilty, they believe that you stole the cookies from the cookie jar, then a judge would determine the punishment based on the law. But for now, the judge would determine, all right, do you spend 1 year in prison? Do you get 1 year with no television for putting your hand in the cookie jar? So this is the basics of the American judicial system, the court system. What happens when you are accused of a crime? Something that's very important to know. And to really understand why our system is the way that it is, we have to go back to the founding of our country. We have to go back to the American Revolution. And of course, it all started with the French and Indian War, right? The American colonists, the King of England, were on the same side. Everything was kumbaya, let's go do a war. We're going to have a fight against the French and the Indians, and whooped them, kicked their butts. But the problem was that in order to wage that war, the King of England borrowed $133 million from the bank. Always pay attention to the banks, because the banks fund every war. In fact, usually the same bank will fund both sides of a war. So banks are very important to war. But the King of England, he was like, hey, I had to do this to help you, colonists. So you're going to have to pay for the war. And the colonists are like, get out of here, no way, you pay for the war. And the king just said, hey, I have the power. I'm levying a stamp tax and a sugar tax on you. And every time you buy sugar, every time you use paper, you just pay a little bit of extra money, and that money will be used to pay back the banks. Well, the colonists didn't like that, and they said, no taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. They said, it's not fair. You're telling us that we have to give you this money. We don't get a vote. Why don't I get a vote? Why don't I get a say in determining if I owe you money? And the king's like, don't worry about that. And the colonists are like, this isn't right. And they're protesting, no taxation without representation, no taxation without representation. But they don't just protest, they boycott. Right? Put your money where your mouth is. They say, we won't buy your tea. We won't buy anything that comes from England. And you won't get the money. In fact, their boycotts were so effective, the king got rid of the Sugar Act. He got rid of the Stamp Act, but he didn't get rid of that Tea Act. And this conflict would continued to escalate. The king put forward the Quartering Act, which was the act where he filled the streets of Massachusetts and the colonies with English soldiers, and he didn't want to pay for the soldiers to be there. He said, the soldiers, the only reason they're there is because you won't just pay your taxes. So if the soldiers need food to eat, you cook it for them. If a soldier knocks on your door and says, hey, can you make me dinner? Start cooking dinner. If a soldier knocks on your door and says, I need somewhere to sleep tonight, you better get a bed ready for them because they're sleeping at your house. Colonists didn't like that, and the colonists would fight back in their own way. And one of the ways they did that was through their boycotts. But if you've ever been around an English person, these guys love tea. The colonists, they came here from England. They wanted their tea for breakfast. They wanted their tea for lunch. So they said, all right, we won't get tea from England, but we still need tea. So these smugglers emerged. These people who had their own boats would take their boats to Spain and France or wherever it was that they could to get some extra tea. They would bring that tea back across the ocean and they would sell it to the American colonists. So the colonists, they had their tea and they didn't have to buy English tea. Well, as you can imagine, this made the King of England and Parliament slightly annoyed. So the king was attempting to stop this practice, and in 1768, the Liberty, a ship owned by John Hancock, was commandeered. It was confiscated. The English Navy boarded the ship with guns, had their cannons pointed at, and said, the Liberty is ours now. This is our boat. And they took John Hancock's boat. And they didn't just take his boat, they also laid a huge fine on him that he had to pay to the King of England. A huge fine? You take my property, you take all this money from me, and I haven't even been found guilty in a court? John Hancock didn't like that, and neither did the colonists, and he became very popular fighting back against the English. Fast forward 2 years, what do you get? The Boston Massacre. Drunk guy stumbles along, walks into a bar, a few words are said, next thing you know, an English soldier takes his gun and bashes the colonist over the head. People see this, they get annoyed. A big crowd of people come around. They're like, who do you think you are? Right? They're like, you don't get to hit one of us over the head with a gun. They're throwing snowballs at this English soldier. 7 of his buddies run up. Oh, boom, boom, boom. All right, we'll protect you. We'll protect you. Next thing you know, someone gets scared. Boom. English soldier opens fire. 3 American colonists dead. 5 more wounded in the streets. There had to be repercussions of this. There was going to be a trial. Was this murder? Was the killing of these American colonists justified? Well, the English soldiers, they wanted that trial to take place in England. They were like, hey, we can't get a fair trial here in Boston where the crime happened. And the colonists said, no, you're not going across the ocean to have a trial in England. This is where you committed the crime. You're not getting out of it that easily. We want the trial here. Well, the English crown, they actually submitted to the American colonists. The colonists were so mad about what had happened that the King of England said, you know what, soldiers? You're on your own here. You're being tried in Massachusetts, in Boston, Massachusetts. And they went to trial. And this really revealed the character of the Founding Fathers. Because as you know, Samuel Adams, his cousin John Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, these were the Sons of Liberty. These were the guys the English soldiers were shooting guns at. So what does John Adams do? He agrees to defend the English soldiers who were firing guns at the Sons of Liberty. He says, I believe that everyone deserves a fair trial. And he planned to give it to them. And he would go on to argue that it was reasonable for the English soldiers to shoot their guns at the colonists because they were surrounded by a mob. They were getting hit in the face with snowballs. And someone got scared. And the next thing you know, it just escalated. And John Adams actually did such an effective job arguing his point And he believed so much in fair trials that the English soldiers were not found guilty of murder. They were found to be innocent of murder. They were guilty of lesser charges, manslaughter, but they didn't have to spend the rest of their life in jail. But it really showed you that the founding fathers, John Adams, really believed in this liberty. He really believed that everyone deserves a trial. You shouldn't just be accused and automatically found guilty. And he showed that in spades. Fast forward, 1773, you get the Boston Tea Party. You get Samuel Adams and these boys, John Hancock, just sneaking in the middle of the night. We're like, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go onto a ship. We're going to board this ship. We're going to take the tea, throw it in Boston Harbor. Now, these are crimes, right? I mean, this is the destruction of millions of dollars worth of property owned by the British East India Tea Company, who is very close with the king. So these guys are committing crimes. I mean, you know, they are very aware of what might happen if they get arrested. Well, fast forward to 1775, and you have Paul Revere. The British are coming, the British are coming. Or our version of it, the British are coming, the British are coming. Why are they coming? To take the guns. The British are coming, the British are coming. Why are they coming? To take the guns, right? So you have Paul Revere's ride, you have Lexington and Concord. What actually happened at Lexington and Concord? I'll show you. This is from the London Chronicle, June 15th, 1775, talking about Lexington and Concord. And here is what it says. Tuesday evening, the 18th instant, the grenadiers and light infantry of the army received private orders to move from Boston at 10 o'clock at night. They were passed over part of the harbor in boats, and on their landing proceeded on the road to Concord, a country town at the distance of 20 miles from hence. Our business was to seize a quantity of military stores and the bodies of Mess Hancock and Adams. Our business was to seize a quantity of military stores and the bodies of John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who are both attainted and were at the place enforcing by all their influence the rebellious spirit of the Provincial Congress. Lexington and Concord, those English soldiers weren't just going to confiscate the guns, they were there to bring back the bodies of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. That's the type of language where they're wanted dead or alive. Doesn't matter. The king just wants their body because the king had charged them with treason. And treason's a big deal. Treason is the worst crime you could be accused of because treason is being a traitor to your country, a traitor to your state. So the penalty for treason is death. The king had put out a death warrant for Samuel Adams and for John Hancock. And you wouldn't just be killed. They didn't just kill people when they were accused of treason. They were drawn and quartered. Now, I chose not to show you a graphic image, but drawn and quartering is a brutal form of torture. So the king wanted Samuel Adams and John Hancock caught and either killed or tortured and killed. That is what these men were dealing with. And it wasn't just Sam Adams. It wasn't just John Hancock. It was all of the founding fathers, George Washington and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Every single one of them that signed the Declaration of Independence essentially signed their death warrant because the king viewed all of them as having committed treason. And if they had lost the war, if they had been caught, they would have been drawn, quartered, tortured, and killed. That is where we come from. That is the forefathers who come before us. That is what they went through. But they declared the Declaration of Independence. And every one of them, all 56 men that signed that document, would have been killed if they were caught. But John Hancock put his signature on that document, and he did it so big and so bold that the rumor has it he wanted to make sure that King George III didn't have to wear glasses to see John Hancock's big old signature right on that document. Well, the American colonists, they would go on to win the war, and they would have to form a new government. And they came up with the Constitution of the United States of America, and they would go on to add a Bill of Rights thanks to John Hancock, who pretty much demanded it, and he was so respected that when he demanded things, they happened because his word moved people. So we covered the First Amendment, free speech, the right to meet up with your friends, right? The right to have a redress of grievances, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. The Second Amendment, your gun rights, right? The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The Third Amendment, you don't have to have soldiers come live with you in your house. The Fourth Amendment, you don't have to allow English soldiers or government officials to search your home. Well, now let's talk about the Fifth through the Eighth Amendments, because they're all about trials. They're all about what happens to a person when they are accused of committing a crime. So I'm just going to go over the basic bullet points because the language is a little complex. The Fifth Amendment protects people from being held for committing a crime unless they are properly indicted, accused. So that just basically means the king can't just say, or a government official can't just say, I think you've committed a crime and now you're on trial. There's a whole process that goes into it. You may not be tried twice for the same crime. So they can't accuse you of stealing the cookies, have you go to trial, your neighbors determine you didn't steal the cookies, and then they just say, we didn't like that decision, we're going to bring in new neighbors and have them hear the case. And if they don't like the decision, if those neighbors decide that you didn't steal the cookies, we'll have you go to trial a third time until we find a group of 12 neighbors that say you're guilty. Government can't do that. You can only be tried one time. And you don't have to testify against yourself in court. Meaning, if you decide you don't want to speak, all you have to say is, I plead the Fifth Amendment, I choose to remain silent. And you can do that as part of your own defense. The Sixth Amendment gives you the right to a speedy trial. So if you're accused of something, the trial doesn't have to linger for years. You have a right to go to trial. The right to a public trial so that there's transparency and your neighbors could see what's actually happening. A right to a local trial. If you are accused of a crime, they don't get to fly you across the country or across the ocean or across the world and have you judged by people in a foreign land. You go on trial where the crime took place. You have the right to an impartial jury, a jury of your peers, your neighbors. So the king can't accuse you, or the government can't accuse you of a crime and say, we also get to determine if you're guilty. No, your neighbors determine if you're guilty, right? People that live in your town, your county, determine if you're guilty. You have the right to be informed of any charges against you, right? So if you're accused of stealing those cookies from that cookie jar, they have to say, we are charging you with stealing. You have the right to confront your accuser. So if your neighbor said, you stole those cookies, I know you did, you have the right to question that neighbor, to get that neighbor in the courtroom and say, really, did you see me steal the cookies? No. Do you have videotape of me stealing the cookies? No. How do you know I stole the cookies? How do you know a mouse didn't eat those cookies? I seen your house. It's dirty. Probably a mouse in there that ate your cookies. You have the right to confront your accuser. And you have the right to attorney, to a lawyer, someone who is trained in law who will assist you in your defense. Now, we're going to get you to a point over the next few years in which you do not need an attorney. We are going to get you to a point in which you are capable of defending yourself as a free individual under God. But that's going to take some time, and when we're done, we're going to make sure that you are very powerful, and it is a great life skill to know how to defend yourself, because in life, people will accuse you of things, and you will be in situations where you want to know how to defend yourself. And then the Seventh Amendment, the same concept as the Fifth and Sixth Amendment, just related to civil matters. So not someone saying you stole the cookie jars, maybe just your neighbor saying, you owe me money, and you said, I don't owe you money, and your neighbor's like, yeah, you owe me money, and you're like, I don't know you owe you money. Well, that could go to a trial as well. So we threw a lot at you. I threw a lot at you here today. I want you to talk to your parents this week about what a trial is, what a jury is, what a judge is, and all of the rights that you have in relation to defending yourself if you are accused. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will see you next week.